The night before we buried my father, I ironed his favorite blue tie and laid it across the guest bed like he was just going to need it in the morning. That's the thing nobody tells you about grief. Your hands keep doing normal things even when your brain has completely stopped working. My name is Maya. I'm 31 years old. I work as a registered nurse at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I am or I was the older of 2 daughters. My father raised us alone after my mother left when I was 9, and my sister Diane was 6. He drove a school bus for 22 years. He grew tomatoes in the backyard. He called me every Sunday at exactly 7 in the evening, no matter what, until the Sunday he couldn't anymore. He died on a Tuesday in March. Cardiac arrest. Sudden. No warning. The paramedics said he probably didn't feel much. I have held on to that sentence like it was something solid. I flew back to Dayton the same night I got the call. Diane was already there when I arrived. She'd moved back home 3 years earlier after her divorce and had been living in the house with my father ever since. She met me at the door with red eyes and open arms, and I held her for a long time in the cold. We planned the funeral together. We chose the casket together. We stood side by side at the viewing and shook hands with people whose names I barely remembered and accepted casseroles from neighbors who had known my father for decades. Diane handled everything with a kind of calm efficiency that I was too wrecked to question. I was grateful for it. I told her so. The funeral was on a Friday. It was the following Monday when everything changed. I was still at my father's house. I hadn't been able to bring myself to book a return flight. I kept walking from room to room like I was looking for something I couldn't name. His reading glasses were still on the kitchen table. His coffee mug was still in the dish rack. I couldn't move any of it. My phone rang at 9:14 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock when I saw the name on the screen. Gerald Marsh. My father's attorney. I had met Gerald once, maybe 4 years earlier, when my father had mentioned offhand that he'd finally gotten around to drafting a will. I remembered a quiet man in his 60s, careful with his words, with a gray cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses. My father had liked him, said he was honest. I answered. Maya. His voice was measured, the way doctors sound when they're about to say something that requires stillness. I'm glad you picked up. I need you to come to my office today if you're able. There are things you need to see before we move forward with the estate. I told him I could be there by 11. Come alone, he said. Then, before I could ask why, please don't mention this call to your sister. I stood in my father's kitchen for a full minute after he hung up, staring at the coffee mug in the dish rack. My heart was doing something strange. I didn't know what I was about to walk into. I just knew, in the way you sometimes know things before you understand them, that something was very wrong. Gerald's office was in a small brick building on the west side of Dayton, the kind of place with a single receptionist and a waiting room that smelled like old wood and carpet cleaner. He met me at the door himself and led me back to his office without stopping to make small talk, which told me something. He closed the door behind us and sat down across from me and folded his hands on the desk. How much did your father tell you about his finances? He asked. I said not much. He'd always been private about money. I knew he owned the house outright, paid off years ago. I assumed he had some savings. He'd lived simply. Gerald nodded slowly. He opened a folder on the desk and turned it to face me. Your father came to me 14 months ago, he said. Not to update his will. To ask me what his options were if he believed someone was stealing from him. The room felt like it tilted slightly. He didn't know who, Gerald continued. Or he didn't want to say. But he had noticed withdrawals from his savings account, regular, moderate amounts, spaced out in ways that might not immediately trigger suspicion. Over the course of approximately 2 years, someone had taken just over $64,000 from an account your father had never given anyone else access to. I heard the number. I heard it clearly. I just couldn't attach it to anything real. He asked me to help him document what had happened before he decided how to handle it, Gerald said. He didn't want to go to the police right away. He wanted to understand it first. He paused. He also, and I want you to hear this carefully, he also revised his will during that same visit. Significantly. He slid a second document across the desk. I read it. I had to read it twice. My father had left the house, his remaining savings, and all personal property equally divided between me and a local literacy foundation he'd volunteered with for years. Diane was not mentioned. Not a single line. I looked up at Gerald. When did he change this? I asked. 14 months ago. The same day he first described the withdrawals to me. I put the paper down on the desk because my hands were starting to shake. He knew, I said. It wasn't a question. He suspected, Gerald said carefully. He never said her name to me directly. But the account in question, your father added Diane to it as a secondary holder 3 years ago, when she moved back in. He'd done it so she could help manage household expenses. Groceries, utilities, practical things. 3 years ago, when she moved back in. After her divorce. The withdrawals began approximately 8 months after she was added, Gerald said. I sat there in that quiet office and tried to hold on to something steady. I thought about Diane standing at the door when I arrived. I thought about how efficiently she had handled the funeral arrangements. I thought about all the times over the past 3 years when she'd called me to talk about how hard things were, how much she was sacrificing, how lucky I was to have my own place and my own life. I had felt guilty. I had sent money twice when she said she was struggling. I asked Gerald what happened next. He told me my father had hired a forensic accountant quietly, through Gerald's office, to document the full trail of withdrawals. He had also, in the months before his death, moved his remaining savings into a separate account that Diane had no access to. He had been building a case. He had been doing it alone, without telling me, because he hadn't wanted to fracture the family until he was certain. And then his heart had stopped on a Tuesday in March, and he had never gotten to finish what he'd started. He left a letter, Gerald said. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting, that careful, slightly tilted print I had known my entire life. He left it with me 18 months ago and asked me to give it to you after he was gone. He said he hoped you'd never need to read it, that he hoped he'd be able to handle it himself. I held the envelope for a long moment without opening it, then I did. I'm not going to share everything my father wrote. Some of it is mine. But I will tell you this. He wasn't angry. That was the thing that broke me completely. He wasn't angry. He was sad, and he was tired, and he was sorry that I was going to have to deal with this without him. He said he had loved Diane with everything he had and that he didn't understand how it had happened and that he blamed himself for not seeing it sooner. He said he had kept it from me because he knew I would try to fix it immediately, and he hadn't been ready for that. He ended the letter by telling me he was proud of the person I had become. I sat in Gerald's office and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the moment I found out he was gone. When I could breathe again, I asked Gerald what the forensic accountant's report showed. He walked me through it. $64,215. Withdrawn in increments ranging from $300 to $1,200, never the same amount twice in a row. Never on the same day of the month. Methodical. Patient. The kind of pattern that suggests not impulsiveness but planning. There were also credit card statements, cards opened in my father's name, his social security number, his date of birth that he had never opened himself, 2 of them. Together they carried a balance of just over $19,000. Electronics, clothing, travel, a hotel stay in Miami in October, a flight to Las Vegas in January. None of it charged by a 70-year-old man who drove a school bus and grew tomatoes in his backyard. Identity theft, on top of the account withdrawals. On top of everything. I asked Gerald if my father had contacted law enforcement. He said my father had been preparing to. He'd been waiting until the documentation was complete. He'd wanted to be thorough, because he knew he'd told Gerald this directly that Diane would deny everything, and he wanted there to be no room for doubt. I asked Gerald what I should do. He said the decision was mine. The documentation existed. The forensic report existed. The new will was clear and legally sound. I could pursue it criminally, civilly, or both. What I could not do, he said quietly, was unknow what I now knew. I drove back to my father's house. Diane's car was in the driveway. She was in the kitchen when I came in, making coffee, and she looked up and smiled and asked where I'd been. I said I'd gone for a drive. Needed some air. She nodded sympathetically and poured me a cup without asking if I wanted one, the way you do when you've lived with someone for a long time and know their habits. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where my father's reading glasses were still sitting, and I watched her move around the kitchen, and I thought about $64,000 disappearing in increments of $300 to $1,200, never the same amount twice. I stayed calm. I am a nurse. I have learned to stay calm in rooms where staying calm is the only useful thing you can do. That night, after Diane went to bed, I called Gerald back and told him I wanted to move forward. All of it. Criminal and civil. I asked him to recommend someone who handled elder financial abuse cases. He gave me a name. I also called a detective I'd spoken to once at the hospital, years earlier, a woman named Sharon who had interviewed a patient in my unit in connection with a fraud case. I had her card in my phone for reasons I couldn't have explained at the time. I called her at 10:30 at night and she picked up, and I told her I needed help, and she said she would come to Gerald's office the next morning. I did not sleep. Detective Sharon arrived at Gerald's office at 8 the next morning, before I'd had a second cup of coffee. She was a compact woman in her 50s, practical, with a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being filed carefully in the right place. She reviewed the forensic report and the credit card statements and the account records, and she asked me a series of questions, some of which I could answer and some of which I couldn't. She said what had been done to my father constituted elder financial exploitation under Ohio law, which is a felony. She said the credit card fraud constituted additional felony charges. She said she wanted to move quickly, before Diane became aware that anything was happening, and before anything in the house documents, devices, anything could disappear. She asked me if I was prepared for what came next. I said yes. I went back to the house. I kept my voice normal. I helped Diane sort through some of my father's clothes to donate to the church, because she had suggested it and I didn't want her to sense anything shifting. I carried boxes to the car. I made dinner. I sat across from her at the table where my father had eaten breakfast for 30 years, and I talked about ordinary things, and I did not let my face tell her anything. 2 days later, when Diane was at the grocery store, 2 detectives and a forensic tech arrived at the house with a warrant. They took my father's laptop, a tablet that turned out to belong to Diane, bank statements from the filing cabinet in the office, and a prepaid debit card they found in Diane's coat pocket in the closet. They were done and gone in under 2 hours. Diane came home with groceries. She put them away. She didn't notice anything missing. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her and felt something that I still don't have the right word for. Not hatred. Something older and heavier than that. Something like grief with a different shape. 3 weeks later, the DA's office called Gerald. They had enough. Diane was arrested on a Thursday morning. I was back in Columbus by then. Gerald called me when it happened, and I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and listened and didn't say anything for a long time. I will tell you what she had done because you deserve to understand it completely. 3 years ago, when she moved back in after the divorce, she had access to my father's mail. She had opened accounts in his name using documents she found in his filing cabinet, his social security card, a copy of his birth certificate he'd kept in a folder for exactly the situations you're supposed to keep those things for. She had applied for the 2 credit cards online. She had set up automatic forwarding on his paper statements, so that anything related to those accounts came to a P.O. box she'd opened. The withdrawals from the shared account had begun gradually. Small enough, at first, that my father might have assumed he'd misremembered a purchase. She had timed them carefully. She had learned his habits, his rhythms, the way people do when they live in the same house. She had, by the time my father noticed and began quietly building his case, taken a total of $83,000 when you included the credit card debt she'd run up in his name. My father had died without ever confronting her directly. He had died still hoping. I think that he had made some kind of mistake. That there was an explanation he hadn't thought of yet, because that is the kind of man he was. The motive, which I know you're wondering about, the forensic accountant found evidence of significant gambling losses. Not dramatic, casino, floor gambling, online betting, sports, mostly. It had started small, during her marriage, and had grown after the divorce, when she'd had more time and more anxiety, and less oversight. She had burned through her own savings, then her divorce settlement, and then she had started on my father. She had been, the entire time, telling anyone who asked that she was sacrificing her life to care for an aging parent. She pleaded guilty to elder financial exploitation and identity theft in September. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to make full restitution of the $83,000. My father's house sold in November. Per the will, half of the proceeds and the remaining savings went to the Literacy Foundation. The other half came to me. I have put it in an account that I haven't touched. I'm not sure I'll ever feel like that money belongs to me in any normal way. But I know my father wanted me to have it, and I know he trusted Gerald to make sure that happened. And I think honoring that trust is the most useful thing I can do with a grief I'm still figuring out how to carry. But I want to tell you, and I've thought about how to say this, because I don't want it to come out as a warning or a lecture, just as the truth is that it was the smallest things that should have told me something. The way Diane always steered conversations about money away from specifics, the way she got slightly tense the one time I offered to help my father review his finances during a visit, the way she had, now that I look back, consistently positioned herself as the one who understood my father's needs better than I could, from a distance. None of those things are proof of anything by themselves. But they were a shape, and I didn't see the shape until someone handed me documents that made it undeniable. My father called me every Sunday at exactly 7 in the evening. He called me and he talked about his tomatoes and the weather and whatever book he was reading, and the whole time for at least 2 of those years he was quietly, carefully trying to protect me from something he was carrying alone. I wish he had told me. I understand why he didn't. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I think they will stay true for the rest of my life. If someone in your life suddenly has explanations for everything, if the access they were given for practical reasons is never questioned, if the person who is supposed to be protecting a parent is also the only one managing the information about that parent, pay attention. You don't have to be suspicious of everyone you love, but you can pay attention. Gerald still calls me sometimes with updates on the restitution. The Literacy Foundation sent me a note after the estate closed, thanking my father by name for his generosity. They said they were going to name a reading program after him. I think he would have liked that. He always said reading was the thing nobody could take from you. He was almost right about that.